Dr. Rima Laibow, welcome to the Gnostic Media Podcast. I was actually turned on to your work recently by a mutual friend of ours, Clint Richardson. And, when I saw what you had to say in a little short online video clip about Aldous Huxley and the Brave New World and creating deltas through autism, all of the research that I've been looking at regarding Huxley, MK Ultra, eugenics, all of these backgrounds, the low-fat diet, high-carbo diet, etc., all of these things tied in to exactly what you were presenting in this short video. And furthermore, I had interviewed guys like Dr. Andrew Wakefield, who lost his medical license over exposing this stuff, and he and I had a really good conversation. And all of this stuff really comes together with your work and probably with my work also. We sort of merge everything together into a really clear picture. So I'm really happy to have you here on the Gnostic Media Podcast. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Jan. I'm just delighted, first of all, to have made your acquaintance. And we had a lovely, more than 2-hour initial conversation that was very stimulating. You know, when you find someone who gets it, but most intriguingly gets it from another angle, it's very stimulating. And it's much more pleasant than talking to people who say, I can't hear you because that would cause me to become uncomfortable. So I prefer to stay deaf, which is unfortunately a fluoridated common response. But it was a pleasure meeting you, and I'm delighted to be here today.
Likewise, pleasure meeting you. And so, we might as well just dive right into this strange topic here. I haven't gone through a whole lot of your work other than our 2.5-hour plus long conversation the other day going over all of this. But so why don't you start off first by telling the audience who you are, a little bit about your background, educational background, where you're from, etc.
I'd love to. I'm an MD. I actually am a medical school survivor. I am licensed in 3 states in the United States, Connecticut, New York, and Washington State. Astonishingly, I still have my license in spite of the fact that I practice non-standard of care medicine. I have never, in my 43 years of medical practice, written a prescription for a drug. I'm trained as a psychiatrist, child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist, and can testify to you that there is such a thing as drug-free psychiatry. There's also drug-free medicine, and both of those work very, very well. Let me say that I do not consider them alternative medicine because, indeed, the language shapes the way we understand things. And I believe there is an alternative medicine, and except in an emergency room or a surgical suite, that alternative is a poor alternative. It's called allopathic or pharmaceutical medicine. So I practice advanced medicine and have done so for my entire career. Why? Because when I was in medical school, I had the huge advantage of coming to it totally unprepared. So I had a tabula rasa. I had a blank slate for a mind. I knew a lot of literature and history, but I didn't know physiology and microbiology and biochemistry and so on. So I could actually learn it without preconceptions. And on my first day in pharmacology, which was a required major course, I learned from a very famous pharmacology professor that all drugs work in the same way. They work by poisoning enzyme systems. And I raised my hand and I said, excuse me, isn't that a problem? Because enzymes are the stuff of life. And if you're poisoning them, how are you helping anybody? And the answer was, sit down and shut up, kid. And I thought, this is not working for me. I need to understand this. And as I came to understand more and more and ask questions, which were not very well received, I understood that if you like the way a drug works, you call it a therapeutic benefit. If you don't, you call it a side effect, but there are only side effects. And I said, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way to help the body, the mind, the brain, the heart, whatever, to heal, to become whole, and to express its own genetic and biochemical capacity without poisoning it. So I determined that I would never use something that would poison a person, and I would never do anything to a patient that was different from what I would want done to me or those I loved most dearly. That meant I couldn't use drugs. I had to be a psychiatrist without using drugs. I had to be a physician without using drugs. And that meant that I had to think. A dangerous occupation in medicine, I can tell you. It also meant that I was free.
And I thought doctors were supposed to think, sorry.
Well, that's a mythology that we all subscribe to. You see, when I went into medical school, I had no idea that I was entering a brainwashing program. I had no idea that I was going to be subjected to protein deprivation, sleep deprivation, ritualized humiliation, the creation of a special language, and the creation of funny handshakes and special suits that only the initiates got to wear. Think about it. That's called mind control. That's called brainwashing. And that's what medical education is. You learn a special language. You learn that only you can understand certain deep, arcane concepts. And as you rise in the hierarchy, you get to humiliate those below you in retribution and restitution for what you have done.
And it's funny, the whole medical literature, and it's like when you learn the Latin, it's like, oh, so tummy ache is just tummy ache in Latin, but they say it in Latin so that it sounds...
Acus stomachus. And we, of course, know what that means. It means tummy ache.
Right. But, but the funny thing is it's the same lingo. It's just in Latin, and they use this dead language to make it sound more intelligent and official than just tummy ache,
Exactly. Because the whole mythology and methodology is to remove you from control of your own wisdom, your own knowledge, your own body, your own healing. Because if I am the priest-like conveyor and owner of wisdom, and you are the supplicant, I can give or withhold, and you are dependent upon me, and now I can sell you drugs. And that's the deal.
So you were indoctrinated?
No, I was...
well, they tried to indoctrinate you.
Exposed to indoctrination.
Right, exactly. They attempted to indoctrinate you. But so was Thomas Saz correct in your opinion about psychiatry?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thomas Saz was a great pioneer. His own personal practice, as I understand it, was pharmaceutical, but there you go. At least he understood the deal. And there is a huge myth of mental illness, but then again, there is a huge myth of illness. And I came to understand that the pharmaceutical medical complex is only a part of what I call the Uber cartel. The Uber cartel is medicine serving pharmaceutical industry, which is the same industry as the agrochemical industry, which is the same industry as the biotech industry, which profits only when you are ill. And underlying all of this, at a much deeper level still, is the real agenda, which is depopulation.
Well, that's for sure. So how did you get into studying Aldous Huxley and his relation to all of this?
I was a literature major in college. I actually was one of those few physicians who could read and think. It was a distinct handicap, as I've indicated, but I managed to survive. By the way, my greatest asset in surviving this brainwashing was that I was fortunate enough to have a psychotic mother and psychotic family members, so that I spent my entire childhood trying to figure out what was sane, what was insane, what was true, and what was untrue. So my bullshit meter was finely tuned and pegs very, very rapidly. And that's how I resisted the brainwashing. But I had read Brave New World. I had read all of Ayn Rand's literature. I had read all of the dystopian fiction, quote fiction, some of it for school, some of it for my own curiosity. And I am by nature intensely curious, and I want to understand people. And to understand people, you have to understand fantasy. And to understand fantasy in the mind, you have to understand anthropology, and you have to understand social organization. And so I was on a quest to understand how people individually and collectively work, think, feel, dream, and shape their world. A professor of mine in psychoanalytic training once said that psychiatrists and psychologists are people who have trouble understanding what everybody else understands intuitively, and so they have to study it. And that certainly was true in my case. So I was no stranger to dystopian futures, nor was I a stranger to social control mechanisms. And I saw that Huxley was writing a manual, a usage manual. I also am a science fiction buff.
You and I are exactly on the same page on that. And I tried to tell people, he's not out there warning people. He's writing the manual of how to do it. And they just, they get so caught up. No. He's warning people. If you get in and read his letters, like in his book Moksha, etc., he's actually talking about that he's there at the Josiah Macy Foundation conferences with guys like Gregory Bateson, who were the key founders of MKUltra. Now, MKUltra came out of the Macy conferences. That was a key thing that put the whole MKUltra program together. And these people are all there at them. But interestingly, you had brought up anthropology. Have you ever studied the work of Professor David Price?
Yes.
Okay. What do you think about his work on weaponizing anthropology?
Tell me what, from an academic and a social manipulation point of view, what discipline has not been intentionally weaponized? Grammar has been weaponized, for God's sakes.
The worst thing that they do with grammar is they put logic before grammar, and so then people can't think because they don't gather data first. They leap to conclusions. They have to appeal to authority to get that answer. Where the trick with grammar, there's actually two types, special grammar and general grammar. Special grammar deals with a specific language and the punctuation, etc. But general grammar deals with like the nouns and the words out in the world that we're actually using, and the who, what, where, and when. And so one of the biggest tricks with manipulating grammar for mind control is getting people to try and put why before who, what, where, and when. So they have no data, no input. And so then they try to just process a conclusion from nothing, and they're left to always come up to false conclusions, or then they have to appeal to some authority who they think can think, rather than learning how to think themselves.
I spent many years practicing psychiatry without drugs. That meant I talked to and I listened to people. And I had been a student of Alfred Korzybski and semantics and the process by which knowledge is knowable. I found that incredibly fascinating. And so as I talked to people and listened to them and communicated with them in their systems, their internal systems and their interpersonal systems, I came to exactly the same conclusions that you've just articulated without using those terms. And my job was very often the clarification, if you will, of emotional grammar and of experiential grammar to process who, what, where, when, why, and how in a sequence that made sense rather than in a sequence that was just felt or mapped through prior experience.
Let me ask you, being a literature major, did they train you in the ancient trivium at all?
Not at all.
Not at
However,
all.
not at all.
However, that's
However,
horrible.
Because, you're talking about an educational system based not on leading but on directing. Educare, to bring forth, to lead
Sure.
forth, is not what education is. And even though I was educated a long time ago, I graduated from university in 1964. So I entered medical school in 1966 and graduated from medical training in 1970. There are actually still people alive who were doing things then, and I'm one of them. But the point is that even then, we had more logical focus. We were required to write and think logically and coherently and articulately, but the nature of logic was a specialized pursuit. I went after it, but it wasn't part of a literature curriculum by any means.
So are you able to identify all of the logical fallacies off the top of your head?
Yes. Full
Good.
of shit category 1, full of shit category 2, full of shit category 3. And just
So,
generalized full of shit indefinite.
I caught you mentioned Ayn Rand, and of course, in the New Age movement and everything, Ayn Rand is heavily attacked and all of this sort of stuff. But and I had dismissed her for years, etc. myself. But a couple of years ago, I started studying her because I didn't want to use the fallacy of killing the messenger. And it's like, oh, wait, if I don't think with fallacies, then I actually have to go and see what someone says before I can judge them. And then through the Trivium research, we got into someone that she worked with, Dr. Leonard Peikoff. Now, his politics are absolutely horrible, but he's got one of the best logic courses out there, ironically. His problem, again, is that he likes to leap to conclusions without the data. So, again, he's putting his logic before his grammar. And but one of the quotes, I think it was at the end of his History of Philosophy lecture series, he talks about how mysticism is always the tool of tyrants. What do you think about that?
I think everything is the tool of tyrants. When a tyrant has determined that tyrannical behavior is needed, they will use any tool to hand, whether it's mysticism or rationalism or materialism or execution or cuddly
Sure.
teddy bears jumping around.
Let me try to put in a little more context, because what we're looking at is this selling of the mysticism that you can't know anything. They're coupling it together with quantum physics, which then they couple together with Hinduism, etc. Now, when you think of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World and these different castes that he has in there, and then you think of the Hindu caste system, and then you think of how Huxley is selling this idea of soma in his books to control the masses, and then he's working with Gordon Wasson, who then makes the claim that soma is the from the Rig Veda is the mushrooms, and then so now they're selling this idea of soma, Eastern religion, and psychedelics together along with quantum physics. So in this sense, we can see that they're actually selling a specific type of mysticism, and apparently they're trying to get us back to the old Hindu caste system through Huxley's work. Would you agree with that?
I think that one of the things that Huxley was, it's difficult not to say huckster, but it's one of the things that Huxley was pushing was indeed the Western analog of the Hindu caste system. Another thing that he was pushing was mindless subservience for most of the population. Another thing that he was pushing was absolute and total social control of all biological and physiological functions, so that everything exists only with the permission and at the behest of the state. Mao was pushing that too. Hitler was pushing that too. Obama is now pushing that. Bush was pushing that. This
Stalin,
is transnational. Yeah. Stalin. I'm sure Genghis Khan was doing it within the context of his own technological measure. I want to introduce the concept of the final common pathway here. There are a lot of ways for things to function wrong, to fail. But there are only a few ways for that failure to express itself. For example, a brain can only do a few things. It can hallucinate, it can process language, it can think into the future, it can remember the past, it can have a stroke and lose memory, and so on. There's a limited number of things that a brain can do wrong. There's a limited number of things that your hand can do wrong. But there are a lot of ways to get your hand to the position where it isn't functioning well. So there are many, many causes that converge on final common pathways. Tyranny has only a few ways of controlling and restricting and damaging. One of them is to take away personal thought, individual understanding. One of them is to take away personal action, economic and political action. Another way is to take away the right to assemble and to isolate people. Another way is to imprison people. Another way is to kill them. And you need spies to do that. You add in the technological doodads, bells and whistles, and you get different styles. But, a concentration camp and a killing field have a lot in common. They're both final common pathways for tyrannical ways of controlling and eliminating behavior, thought, understanding, and options. So I don't see I don't see anything unique in the way tyranny attempts to control. I see things that are unique in the technologies that they have available to them. NSA, DEA, and the other intrusive spying that's going on, Department of Homeland Security, that's not new. It's just beefed up with transistors and doodads and microwaves. But it's the same thing as a spy network in Imperial China or Tsarist Russia. I don't see that it's different. It's just spiffier.
Now, on the 11th...
Does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does. On the 11th, you have an online conference coming up, and you have a number of people that are going to be joining you for that, including myself and Clint Richardson. Why don't we delve into some of the topics that are going to be discussed there, such as autism and your theory that autism has been intentionally created to actually create a dumbed down sort of drone worker force that Aldous Huxley details in his book, The Brave New World.
Absolutely. And that takes us back to there are only so many ways that you can oppress people. You can rationalize it and get there a lot of different. By the way, about the spiritualism, religion of one sort or another, whether it's Eastern spiritualism or Catholicism or Judaism or Hinduism, whatever, any ism, in my view, is always a way of exercising tyrannical control over the ists, the people who subscribe to the ism. What do religions do? Inevitably, they control sexuality, they control wealth, and they control thought. So if you add in the caste system, you've got Brave New World. You've got New Age spirituality. But you can do the same thing with Catholicism.
All they did with Brave New World and the New Age was flip all of the old Catholicism stuff. We have to liberate sex. It's the inverse of the Oedipus complex. And so we can actually see that they went through and they said, okay, well, let's reverse this and let's reverse that.
Precisely.
With the Renaissance, we sort of had a bringing back of the classical arts so that people could think, they could design beautiful arts, they could get involved in things, and then now we see through John Dewey and the compulsory education system and all of this stuff, this whole dumbing down of the kids, and now this whole uproar over core that's just coming out. That in fact, Clint and I just released his show on core education, and that big scandal last night, more than 2 hours there. But we can see this whole attack on the education and taking the thinking away, and then on, they hit us from so many angles too in this. And you and I touched briefly the other day on Sally Fallon's work, for instance. And I know when you were in medical school, you didn't rush out and get on the low-fat, low-salt, high-carbo diet, did you?
I didn't do anything they told me to do. I told you my bullshit meter is exquisitely honed. Doing. I said, that doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense at all. Why does the body make cholesterol? If I go back to my biochemistry text, it says that the body needs cholesterol because cholesterol, for example, low fat diet, cholesterol is the skeleton molecule for every sex hormone. Therefore, if you want to control people's, and for the nervous system.
And the brain, oxy or hydroxy cholesterol is what forms the brain as well.
Exactly. And so I said, wait a minute, wait. They want to take that away, and they think that they're doing something good when in fact what they're doing is inducing long-term unclassified harm to millions and millions of people. Let me tell your listeners, they all may know this, but maybe they don't. Most people don't. When a drug is approved by the Fraud and Death Administration and its analogs in other countries, when a drug is approved, it goes through Category 1, Category 2, and Category 3 trials, Stage 1, 2, and 3 trials in the laboratory on animals and on humans, and those trials are completely fallacious because of the statistical insanity that is permitted. And then a drug is approved for general use in the population. However, most people think that means the drug has been found to be safe and effective. No, what it means is that it is approved for Category 4 or Stage 4 trials. Stage 4 trials is let's give it to lots of people under lots of different circumstances and see if it's too toxic to keep on the market. And approximately 50% of the drugs that are approved by the Fraud and Death Administration in the United States for general use in the population are withdrawn quietly, generally, within 5 years because they are too deadly even for the Fraud and Death Administration to allow to stay on the market. And when you consider what does stay on the market, vaccines, psychiatric medication, cholesterol-lowering drugs, and so on, you realize how deadly they must be. So the fact that it's taught in medical school, which is controlled totally by the pharmaceutical industry, the fact that it's prescribed by your doctor, the fact that it's out there for people to use, if it's a pharmaceutical or a health strategy pushed by mainstream medicine, means you should be very, very, very afraid, and you should run quickly in the opposite direction. I learned that early in medical school. No, I did not go for a low-fat or low-salt diet. You're quite right. Back to autism
and vaccines,
yeah.
Indeed. So let's get into this conference. What is the foundation of your idea behind the relationship between vaccines and this Delta idea that Huxley was selling?
Well, I have to back up a little bit, if I may, and that is to talk about vaccines. Now, I used to believe, was one of the few delusions of modern medicine that I emerged from medical training with. I really did believe that vaccines actually prevented disease. I had not factually examined the data. If I had, I would have learned that every communicable disease that we are no longer dying from in large numbers declined before the advent of the vaccine for that disease.
Could it have been running water?
Could have been clean running water. It could have been more protein. It could have been better fat. It could have been, I don't know, toilets that took the human waste and the contamination away from people. You know, things like cholera, not coming from or not getting cholera because you don't have contaminated water that has feces in it, little things like that. Smallpox, which is spread by the leaping or jumping bed bug generally. You get rid of bed bugs, and the smallpox rate declines precipitously. But I also learned that the best way to predict an epidemic or a pandemic was to track where vaccination programs had been carried out. And in fact, a professor of epidemiology at the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Marconi, has written a magnificent paper in which he talks about predicting epidemics. And the best way to do it is to look where people have been vaccinated. That's where the epidemic will be. So I became very troubled by this, and I started looking more and more deeply into vaccinations, and I realized that the entire vaccine thought process and behavioral system is indeed one of the most elaborate and horrifying scams that has ever been foisted on a population. There is no reason to ever inject foreign protein or mercury or aluminum or anything else into the body except nutrients. Sometimes you need vitamin B6 in an injection form or an IV form.
No.
So
let me just ask you this, though, Rima. People are just jumping out of their chairs right now. They're screaming as they're hearing this. Rima, you're crazy. You're going to affect herd immunity. What do you say to that?
I am. Herd immunity. Oh, there goes my bullshit meter. Doing. There is no such thing as herd immunity. If you're vaccinated and that protects you, I can have the disease that you're protected against and you are untouched by it. On the other hand, if you're vaccinated and you're not protected and I have the disease, you will likely get it worse than somebody who wasn't vaccinated because your immune system has been damaged by the process of that very vaccination. There is no way to inject toxins into people's bodies, especially repeatedly and frequently, i.e., as with children, and not damage their immune system. Duh. So we're talking about statistical reality and social myth. The social myth is that we need vaccines. We don't need vaccines. We need health. We need good food. We need immunity, which comes from getting chickenpox as a kid, getting measles as a kid.
So for good food, should people run out and eat their whole wheat grains?
Certainly not. People should be eating, now if they can get ancient wheat, if they can get wheat that has not been crossbred, hybridized, and altered or genetically modified, then they can eat a small amount of wheat, and some people will be okay.
We should remind people that even the older forms of wheat do contain a lot of LDL cholesterol, et cetera, that's going to tax the liver for about 5 days to get that stuff out of the body from the time you eat it. Generally, grains do have the liver has to work extra hard to get that stuff out of the body.
Yes, indeed it does. And when people went from a meat-based diet to a grain-based diet, their stature shrank and their lifespans shrank.
And their waists grew significantly. And you can, and I've spent time down in South America and Europe where there's almost no obesity. And then the other day I took my son to a water park here, and I was astounded. I mean, there were people that were 80 and 100 pounds overweight walking around in bikinis, and almost no one there was in a state of what we would call healthy. I mean, I saw maybe 5 or 10 people there that looked like healthy people.
And that's just the exterior level of health. God knows what their coronary arteries and their cerebral vessels were like, and so on, and what their biochemical profiles were like, what their magnesium levels were like. Virtually everyone is magnesium deficient, etc. By the way, I practice nutritional medicine, so I'm right on the same page that you are. So we're talking about
and just to point out to everyone, you and I are coming from completely different places and angles, and actually here we're discussing the exact same things and going, yep, that's right.
My practice husband was a biochemist, and he was a pragmatic guy in a lot of ways. And he used to say, the answer has to make sense. Now, when the answer makes sense, people can converge on it from different directions, and they still come to the same
Do you
answer.
mean it's in the commons, like where we get common sense from?
Yeah, think. Yeah, think. I'll tell you, it's not in the educational system, that's for sure, and that's intentional. So I came to understand that health has very little to do with medical treatment. Health has to do with things that medicine poo-poos and degrades because they're financially counterproductive for the medical structure. I came to understand that vaccines were dangerous. I came to understand that unvaccinated children meet the standards of what I was taught normal behavior was back in the 1970s when I did my child and adolescent psychiatry training, and that vaccinated children are all vaccine damaged, some to a greater extent, some to a lesser extent. I came to understand that unvaccinated populations are healthy. They don't have asthma, they don't have autism, they don't have this, they don't have that, and they have 1/3 less overall mortality from all causes. You start vaccinating, you start killing. I came to understand this, and I said, how come this is so easily understood? And how come the state and the medical profession and the schools and the international organizations push vaccination when it's so clear that mercury is so deadly, when it's so clear that aluminum is so neuro and endocrinotoxic, when it's so clear that this is profound craziness? Why do they not put it together? And that didn't make any sense to me. And then I understood about the depopulation agenda, and I understood about Rockefeller creating medicine and also introducing eugenics to Germany and supporting one of my heroes until I understood this, Margaret Sanger, because I believe that women have perfect control
dirty.
over their bodies. Dirty, dirty, dirty. Another one of my heroes was John Dewey. How wonderful. Make it a part of education for people to feel things. These are wonderful ideas, but they are all turned to the suppression of humanity and to the depopulation of humanity. So these monsters,
really certain segments of humanity is what they're really targeting.
Well, yeah. Them,
right?
Not us.
And for those who don't know, Margaret Sanger, she's the one who founded Planned Parenthood. She worked with Bill Gates' father. She also invented the birth control pill, and she was heavy into eugenics.
Heavy, heavy, heavy. Specifically, the eugenics of people with more melanin in their skin than you and I have, people who were classified as blacks, and she created Planned Parenthood to eliminate them. I was part of the feminist movement, and I believed that I actually owned my own body and my own fate, and that's still true. I still believe that. I believe that each of us does. But the globalists, the depopulationists, the suppressionists, the enslavers, the tyrants believe that they can take any concept and turn it to their good. That's why I said it's not just mysticism, it's the concept of who owns my body. If that's used to foment tyranny and tyrannical suppression, then it's a great idea that becomes an evil construct. And I believe that that's true of almost every idea. So I said, wait, this doesn't make sense. And I said, how can it be that these people continue to suppress the reality? There must be another agenda. And then it began to tie together to me. And then one day, a friend and colleague of mine who is a brilliant, brilliant contributor to our understanding, especially of the vaccine issues. Her name is Christina England, and she lives in England. She called me one day, and she said, oh my God, I just realized what vaccines are for. I said, what are they for? She said, they are for the creation of a worker drone class for the globalists. And suddenly, you know how when you're in the presence of truth, your body and your mind and your heart go doing and you get
Sure,
it?
yeah, and all of the contradictions are suddenly removed, and aha, I get the
Exactly.
whole picture now, and that's exactly what happened to me when I saw your little later 10-minute video the other day. And it was like, I had been looking at all of this stuff, and I knew Huxley was doing it all and his brother, and it was all tied to Darwin and the Esalen Institute, and they're selling all of the New Age and the psychedelics and the spirituality and the Eastern religions and combining them together. And then you say, oh, yeah, this is for creating deltas. And it's, oh, duh, the whole time we've been looking at
How
Huxley.
come I didn't think
Sure,
of that?
exactly. And the whole time, we're looking at Huxley, and it's in his book. It is the outline of that, and we see that they're, putting different drugs in the babies or in the fetuses while they're, nesting, whatever the word is,
In utero. In utero.
in utero. And then, the whole story is about this one guy who gets the wrong chemical mixture in his thing, and he, goes out of his normal assigned category, etc. So, I mean, when you look at all of this, and we can also, I think, thank Aldous Huxley for all the drugs in the water system today, and not just the fluoride, but all of that. I think that was Huxley's idea.
Yes.
And Huxley, actually, in his book Moksha, he talks about how he wants a drug for every single stage of humanity, and that by having all of these drugs, we're going to somehow evolve. But one of his tricks that he loves to use is this word transcendence. And, the New Age movement is all about this whole transcendence thing. But when you actually read Huxley's work, and what he thought it was he wanted to get you so high that you transcended mentally your physical space conditions and reality, and you didn't care about it anymore. That's what he considered transcendence. So he wanted to make sure that you were high enough that you didn't care that you were a slave, and furthermore, he wanted to make sure that you were high enough that you loved being a slave.
I want to point out that the difference between 1984, which was also a dystopian user's
Well, that
manual,
was
because Orwell was very much a
Orwell
part
was
of
Huxley's
the
student.
same thought.
Yeah.
Exactly. So we have the 1984 dystopian reality and the Brave New World dystopian reality. And the difference between them is the lack of drugs. You put the drugs into the situation and everybody's
Well,
cool
obviously they
because
did
everybody
both.
has transcended awareness.
Obviously, they did both.
And reality.
Right. And they were both
Yes.
Fabian socialists as well. So we know they were both selling the
Precisely.
socialist agenda, and which is, the Fabian logo is the wolf in sheep's clothing. So, what Huxley's trick was, like Eisenhower and all of these other people that he hung out with at the CIA's Century Club, was to sit there and to always be warning you about this or that going on. But he never once said, my brother and I are engineering a total global plan for all of you dum-dums to get rid of you all. He says somebody out there is doing it, but he never says it's me and my brother that are the engineers behind this. Right.
Precisely.
And so it's just like that President Eisenhower clip when he's warning everybody about the military-industrial complex. Meanwhile, you look in his background, you see he's working with Huxley and Wasson and all of these guys selling this very thing. He was the president. He knows about it. He had to approve of this military-industrial complex and against the Constitution because no standing army was allowed, and because, of course, when you're not occupied by a foreign army from Washington, D.C., the people themselves, when properly armed, can put together the largest army ever to defend and put down any foreign force. So, they want to bring in the military and then, get rid of the militia that's run by the sheriff and all of this stuff so that, we have no local control. And then it's all handed over to this illegal federal army, so to speak. You know what? I wanted to ask you, though, you talked about feminism earlier. Have you ever heard of Karen Strouhan's work? She runs a YouTube blog called Girl Writes What? And she has dedicated years and years of research to exposing what feminism really is and how it was really another one of these eugenics tricks to break apart the family unit so that we would have single mothers that relied on welfare checks from the state, et cetera, and really spun how the working relationship in the family really operated so that they could attack the family. Now, feminism, wasn't that Singer rather than Sanger? Let me just check that one. Margaret T. Singer. She, wait, no, that's not right. Let's see. College of Medicine, UCLA, Berkeley, Patty Hearst, False Memory Syndrome Foundation. Sorry, go ahead.
Let me respond to that. Absolutely, all of that is true, and it was Rockefeller who bankrolled the suffragette movement, and that was an early way to attack the family unit. He had a long range view of how to do this, but at the same time, in the same way that Agenda 21 has taken, and the international organizations that run that little game of depopulation and demoralization, in the same way that they've taken a gorgeous concept, sustainability, and they've turned it into a tool of maximal oppression.
Technocracy.
The same thing is true. Yes, the same thing is true with feminism. It's a gorgeous concept because it's about anybody having the right to move forward to their fullest dream and potential. And I believe in that, whether it's a man or a woman or a giraffe. I think that's all correct. So the fact that it was used, and that's what I was alluding to earlier, that everything becomes a tool of tyranny. The fact that it was used doesn't mean it's wrong. The fact that sustainability is used doesn't mean that we have the right to go out and rape the planet. These are correct concepts that are distorted and used incorrectly against us by creating a jargon where we think we know what we're talking about. You talk about feminism, or I talk about sustainability, and we think we have a common understanding of the concept, when in fact, if it's distorted so it has a special, unique meaning, then we're both using the term, but one of us understands it very differently and is using that unique understanding to control the situation. It's a profound distortion. And so I still am a feminist. There you go. I still believe in environmental balance and harmony. I just don't believe in using these. I believe in lots of things, and I don't believe that anybody owns your body or my body or has the right to enslave us, no matter what words and pretty ribbons they stick on it. So, there I am.
I think you'll really love Karen's work when you get into that, because she, it's just like us understanding Huxley and autism and the deltas and everything. She really brings in a whole other level of understanding to the feminism fiasco, I'll just call it for now.
Well, I'm aware of that. I haven't seen her particular side, but I'm aware of the information, in the same way that civil rights has been used as another tool of oppression. Anything can be turned to bad purposes, including the wish to keep children healthy. There we are at vaccination again. So I said, okay, why is it that this terribly toxic, totally fraudulent system is pushed forward so vigorously? That's vaccination. And I said, can't just be the money. There's got to be something deeper underneath it. And then when Christina England shared with me her awareness that the push to employ autistic people, which is a global push, and which I've talked about in my video and my writing since then, the push to employ autistic people because they're handicapped and they make good workers, when they're not talking about employing people with spina bifida, people with twisted limbs, or people who have Down syndrome but could perform lots of useful tasks. They're specifically talking about the neurologically impaired worker. And Christina realized that that is the future of globalist oppression, because I had talked about something that a patient of mine shared with me that's very relevant here. Because I treat people in ways that are more advanced than they can get in other circumstances. A lot of people come to me for treatment from around the world. Some of those people are ordinary men and women. Some of them are the elite or the super elite. I had a head of state as a patient of mine, and one day she idly said to me, "You know, it's almost time for the great culling to begin." I said, "The what?" She said, "The great culling, C-U-L." I said, "I know the word culling. What are you talking about?" She said, "The culling of the useless eaters." I said, "What's a useless eater?" And
Wouldn't a
she said,
useless eater be an elite who doesn't actually do anything but live off the backs of all of us who produce? Yes.
"Parasite you had in
Yeah.
mind?"
Right.
Yeah, I would say so, yeah. And I said, "What's a useless eater?" She said, "Not what, my dear, but who." I said, "Okay, who is a useless eater?" Because I thought this woman had just slipped a cog and had gone completely insane here in my office. I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Useless eaters," and these are direct quotes. This was a personal conversation with me. She said, "Useless eaters are those people who are consuming our non-renewable natural resources." And I said, did it ever occur to you that you are consuming their non-renewable natural resources?" And she said, "That's an interesting idea. No, I never thought about that." "Well, anyway," she said, dismissing that, "it's almost time to begin the great culling." And I said, "Well, just exactly how many of these useless eaters do you intend to get rid of?" She said, 90%. I said, 90% of what? She said, "The current world's population." And I said, "What?" And she said, 90%. And I said, "Wait a minute. I have to, I don't get this." I said, "Your immense wealth and that of your class depends on the fact that you sell shit to people, a lot of shit. Now, if there are fewer people around for you to sell shit to, how are you going to maintain your immense wealth?" And she laughed and she said, "You really don't understand, do you?" I said, "No, I really don't understand." She said, "The mercantile era, which began in the 14th century with the Hanseatic League in Germany, is coming to an end. We are now moving into the neo-feudalist era, and there will be the neo-aristocrats at the top. Around us, note, around us, our servants and servitors, and below them, our technicians. And of the world's population, we only require about 10% of it to fulfill those requirements. Everyone else is superfluous and will be culled." And I thought to myself, either she is completely mad, or she has just given me the most valuable information that I've ever encountered and the most horrible, or both. And indeed, the situation is both, because she was and is a
So
total
why not
psychopath
expose this
with no
person directly?
connection. Well, it's a very interesting thing. I am bound by an ethical constraint to respect her privacy as I would be yours if you were my patient. I can expose what she told me without exposing her because I cannot violate my value system, which is I don't violate people's privacy ever. So, what she told me is the important thing. And no, it's not the Queen of England and it's not Queen Beatrix. So the point is that the information checked out as I investigated it, and I came to understand what was really going on here. So when we look at the tools and techniques that are being used, everything that we look toward for sustainability and health for ourselves and well-being has been inverted. Health has become the induction of illness. Food has become a poison, a system to spread poison, GMOs being part of that, chemicals being part of that, radiation being another of the genocidal technologies. And that's what we talk about on my website, drrimatruthreports.com. And so when we look at that in the context, or when we look at vaccination in the context of that, and we see what happens to people who are vaccinated, And we understand that their ability to see widely is limited, and their ability to question is limited. And the more autistic they are, the more useful they are in this global scheme of now let's employ the handicapped, specifically the autistic handicapped, because they make great employees, because they are loyal, because they never seek for more advancement, because they don't raise questions, because they follow orders. Christina England, who is the mother of two autistic grown men, called me and said, "Oh my God, that's why they're using, refining, perfecting, and increasing the number of vaccines. It's to make the workforce." And I said, "Oh my God, you're right." And I had chills running up and down my spine, which I have now at the moment, thinking about it. And I said, this must stop. This must stop. And it must stop with the word no for people for themselves and for people for their children. It must stop through knowledge, education, dissemination, and discernment. So I said, well, by God, let's make a video, let's write articles, and let's do a webinar. And that's what we were talking about initially. Let's have a webinar. So because autism is an inside job, it's a false flag against each and every one of us, we decided that we would have the webinar, the first webinar on this topic, on September 11th, 2013. Because just as the World Trade Center and the entire 9/11 nonsense was an inside job brought to you by people who want to destroy what you believe you can rely upon, so autism is brought to you by the same people who want to destroy what you believe you can rely upon, which is normal growth and development for yourself and your children, which is the ability to flower and use neurological and psychological, physiological capacity damaged and destroyed intentionally, not because your doctor wants to destroy you, because your doctor's a dupe in the same way that a general is a dupe, but because the people behind the duping have a very clear agenda. And I don't need to tell your audience about Bill Gates and about the depopulationists, because you've already told them and they know. But vaccines are a weapon of mass destruction, and it must stop.
You know, and this is the same thing, the way that they created the autistic workers through Aldous Huxley, renaming the psychedelics from psychotomimetic, which means psychosis mimicking, to Humphrey Osmond, his pal, and also MI6 CIA guy, and MK Ultra, renaming it to psychedelic or psychodelic. And then it goes from there, and then it's later renamed by Gordon Wasson, who is in charge of MK Ultra Subproject 58, along with Professor Carl Ruck at Boston University, and Jeremy Bigwood and Jonathan Ott. They then renamed them again, yet a third or fourth time. There was another word that Huxley invented that was unmarketable. But so then they create the word entheogen. Interestingly, the psychiatrist Oscar Yoniger, who was a big player behind MK Ultra and the like, he makes a comment in this. It's called A Conversation on LSD, and it's him and Leary and Humphrey Osmond and Stolaroff and all of these other guys that were involved with MK Ultra. And he says, you know, the spiritual experience with psychedelics doesn't happen until you cross the Colorado River. And then Larry says, you know, that's right. And they're all clapping and high-fiving each other and everything, because, you know, when you get the joke, it was Leary and McKenna and Huxley who remarketed them. Now, it's not to say that there may be some spiritual value and use there, but the issue is that without the quadrivium and the trivium and having this background study, to be able to filter through the fallacies and not fall into their New Age and almost knocked over my water. Their New Age and their mind control agendas. You know, you really need this foundational study before you can go in and get real use out of these substances. Because, you know, to us, what we thought was the spiritual experience out of them, they were using it as a psychotomimetic, which by their terms is a psychotic break. And so, the person who's calling it spiritual, what are they looking at? And like I said, I'm not trying to entirely dismiss the idea that there's something potentially there, because there very well could be. But when they remarket them in this way, we can see that they sold them with the specific agenda to the masses. And then what we have then is these people who were former anti-war activists and people who had goals in life were then put towards the commune, etc., where, as you just mentioned, what we've also uncovered was all of this was pushing them towards this neo-feudalist agenda.
And the removal of, shall we say, the fire in the belly that allows people to think for themselves, to move for themselves, to question and quest for themselves, has been a very, very important part of this control system, whether it's through the educational system or the entertainment system, the poisoned foods that we receive, the drugs that we receive. I think your listeners may, and since you're videotaping this, your watchers may find it interesting, if they don't already know, that a number of psychiatric drugs are 50% fluoride by weight.
Yeah, and I actually did know that, and that's another really interesting issue. And they're putting the fluoride in the water, and of course they argue that the whole cover story is that it's for our teeth. But when you get in, and just a month or two ago we put out a video showing, I think it was maybe Clint Richardson's last interview, but on the screen we showed the neurological damage and the nerve cell damage that was caused by fluoride from a video that was actually published in the 1950s.
Well, I'm sure that you've already talked about the fact that when the paperclip scientists, Operation Paperclip scientists, who were fluoride scientists, came from Germany and did two studies, one in Newburgh, New York, and one in Salt Lake City, one for 9 months, one for a year. They were experimenting on children. That should have a fairly unpleasant ring in your ears. But they had two groups of children in each city, and they matched them for age and general health and gender and so on. And they discovered after 9 months and after a year that the children who had the fluoride had more tooth decay, had more bone breaks, had more diabetes, and at that time type 1 diabetes was literally unknown in children, and had more bone cancer, especially boys 11 years old and under had a very rare type of and very, very aggressive type of cancer called osteosarcoma. And they realized that in both cases the fluoridated children did significantly worse in these dangerous areas. And so they published the results by switching the headings in both cases. About 6 years ago, the Fraud and Death Administration of the United States government was forced by the Union of Concerned Scientists, a very good organization, by the way, was forced to re-examine the original data. And they found that indeed the kids who were fluoridated had more tooth decay, more bone breaks, more cancer, more diabetes, and so on. And the interesting thing was, immediately after the publication of these two studies, on the basis of only two studies focusing only on children, the FDA said, we recommend that everybody, old, young, male, female, pregnant, not, everybody have their water fluoridated on the basis of these two pediatric studies whose data was corrupted. And then after they re-examined the data, they issued a statement saying, it is true, the data were completely corrupted, but we still recommend fluoridation for everybody. That should tell you something. Now, with that, and with all of the other damage that is being intentionally inflicted on us, it's kind of a wonder that anybody is still fertile. It's kind of a wonder that anybody is still not facing lethal disease or has already died. We're incredibly resilient, and therefore virology and genetically modified material that produces widespread infertility is being used against us, and vaccines, until we say no, until we say no, 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 and until we begin using the legal system to punish the offenders through the concept of willful negligence. Willful negligence. We have a lot of tools available at our hand if we choose to use them.
Now, the issue with tooth decay, I want to point out, and rather than using fluoride in the water to try and treat tooth problems, the real issue with tooth decay, etc., is one, too many carbos, and two, not enough saturated fats in the diet. And people have actually repeatedly shown, and there's a guy who's got a video now based on Weston A. Price's information, who Sally Fallon had done all that research. Weston A. Price was a dentist, and he discovered that people that ate a proper amount of saturated fats in their diet had perfect teeth. And they used to think that, well, he went around all over the world studying tribes that had no tooth decay, and trying to figure it out, and realized that it was all about having the proper amount of saturated fats and not having so many carbos in the diet. And then what happens with a proper amount of saturated fats and proteins, the teeth are actually naturally able to heal themselves. And in fact, people with cavities, etc., learning Weston A. Price's techniques, and this guy who has this video out, have actually been able to fully reverse cavities, etc., without ever visiting a dentist.
Absolutely. One of the interesting things that Weston A. Price found, and I'm a great admirer of his work, and it must be valid because the entire raw milk component of the Weston A. Price system of health is under such severe and savage attack by the Fraud and Death Administration. So he must have been onto something, because they're attacking our ability to have raw milk, raw grass-fed milk.
And it's been just a second. It's been repeatedly proved that, and they always talk about pathogens, and we have to have it pasteurized, etc. But almost all of these companies that sell raw milk have lower pathogen counts than pasteurized milk, which of course the FDA claims is impossible, but yet all of these companies repeatedly show that their milk has fewer pathogens than pasteurized milk, and it hasn't been touched. So
I have to disagree with you. You use the word almost all of these companies. No, that's not true.
Okay,
all of
my
these
bad.
Companies.
I'll accept that one. I stand corrected. All raw milk companies have proved their products far safer than any of the pasteurized, homogenized stuff out there. And furthermore, pasteurization destroys the lactate in the milk, which is causing such a bad reaction to milk and dairy products in people, because that leads to lactose intolerance, etc.
And homogenization, as I'm sure you've talked about, leads to the micronebulization, the teeny weeny idification of the fat in milk. And that fat then becomes indigestible by the body. It passes through the stomach wall into the bloodstream. And now you've got little fat bubbles roaming around. And the body says, ooh, this is bad, and puts them where they can't make trouble. It puts them in the lining, on the lining of the arteries. And then, since it's a foreign substance, it comes along and it says, this is bad, and it puts a Band-Aid of cholesterol over it. That's called plaque. It's designed to help you.
But we should point out that it's probably very likely the vegetable oils that are causing, the vegetable oil fats specifically, that are causing those tears in the artery walls. I think it's dangerous to just say fats in general on that, because...
No, I didn't say fats in general. I said the homogenized
you're correct.
Fats. The homogenized globules
and I think it's,
are in themselves very dangerous.
And I think it's also a very big contributing factor to that is the vegetable oils, which of course we didn't have 100 years ago.
Absolutely. Well, we had vegetable oils. People would press corn or olives or whatever.
There was olive corn, you had palm kernel coconut oil, and that was pretty much it. You didn't have rapeseed oil or, canola oil and all of this other stuff. And not only that, but they pour Drano and chlorine through this stuff to keep it from going rancid.
That's my point. That this is terribly toxified, very, very far from natural oil. This is an industrial chemical processed, not food. It's a PHUDE, because that's what we buy in our stores. We buy
Food.
PHUDE. It looks like food, it smells like food, and if you're not discerning, it even might taste like food and fool you into thinking that it supports life and health, but in fact it does not. And that is a depopulation tool, just as surely as
Now, let me.
vaccines are.
Can I
So,
ask you a question on this? Now, have you looked at using
no.
smartass? Have you looked at using a high-fat diet to reverse the damages from autism, like like Dave Asprey's work from Bulletproof Coffee and all of that? Have you looked at his work yet?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I have not found that to be
Okay.
sufficient. There are a lot of ways to make things better with people who are neurologically damaged. There are a lot of ways to make things better with people who have cardiac or endocrinological or orthopedic or other kinds of damage. My quest is to find ways to literally give the body and everything that's associated with it, including the mind and the heart, the emotional heart, what it needs to literally repair itself. And so a high fat diet is useful. A good, clean, high fat diet
For
is
sure.
useful, of course, with good protein and good
I'm talking about
nutrient rich vegetables and so on. But that's
grass-fed
not
stuff,
enough.
not your
Yeah,
pasteurized
but that's not enough.
low-end stuff. Anyway,
No, but
all right.
that's not enough in my experience. I find that I have to get smarter than that to totally reverse the damage. And for example, a child was brought to me with autism. This was a vaccine injured child who at 18 months suddenly declined into the typical autistic picture immediately following his healthy baby vaccinations, not untypical. Um, and he was 7 years old when he was brought to me. The parents were on the verge of institutionalizing him and trying to forget that they had ever had this child in their lives because he was so violent and disturbed and difficult to control in every way. He was also a nonverbal child. And I decided through a variety of diagnostic protocols, which are not part of the standard workup that you'll find in a marble and glass palace of health and healing called a hospital. I decided that the problem with this child was that, in the same way that it's possible to have insulin resistance, so the receptors no longer respond to the presence of insulin, so it is also possible to have oxytocin resistance. Oxytocin is the molecule, as you know, of attachment. And this child was profoundly unattached, as many autistic children appear to be. So I decided that what we needed to do was lower the level, the effective level of the neurotransmitter in his body so that the receptors could regain sensitivity. I therefore introduced the frequency that was opposite to the frequency of oxytocin. So I didn't take away any molecules, but I took away the frequency signature of some of his oxytocin. And I did that with a little transducer box that produced a mechanical tone, a mechanical beat that produced the correct tone. And I put it in a little bag that had a nice texture so that he wouldn't reject it. And that first night, he slept curled around it. Had it at his diaphragm, and it basically beat the frequency into his
Was he
body all
having the
night.
same typical problems surrounding the stomach that usually goes with autism? Okay,
Oh,
so
yes.
maybe he
Oh,
was also
yes,
getting
yes, yes.
comfort from the
Absolutely.
beat that it was putting off in his stomach region, or no?
Possibly it may have, because there's a huge amount of oxytocin released in the stomach, as in the intestinal tract as well. The next morning, this nonverbal, profoundly autistic, unrelated child came down to his parents' bedroom, stood at the side of their bed, and said verbally, and I quote, "Can I have some hugs?" He was asking for attachment. And of course, they took him into bed, they held him, they loved him, and they wept because they had access to their child that they hadn't had since he was vaccinated at 18 months. And then the real healing began, and we used nutrients, and we used frequency, and we used behavior modification. We got him the hell out of the public school that was bound and determined to destroy him, and so on and so on. So we used many, many, many strategies. And eventually, we healed this child, and he became the gloriously lovely young man that he is today. But we couldn't do it with one thing. I know an awful lot about supplements and nutrients and nutrition. That wasn't enough. I know a lot about a lot of things. Each one alone was not enough to heal the profound damage that had happened. And this youngster, a year later, would be able to say, you know, I remember when I was autistic, I couldn't love anything. Interesting. Interesting. Is that emotional? Is that nutritional? Is that neurological? Yeah, it's all of them.
Yeah, you know, I have a friend, she's an RN, and she had bought into the system back then. This was, you know, and we turned her on to Weston A. Price and Sally Fallon and all of that stuff as well. But when her son was an infant, she had taken him to the doctor there at the hospital where she worked, and the doctor gave her son 4 vaccinations all at once, and then took him home. Within a few hours, he was going into shock. Her sister was a nurse at the Loma Linda University Medical Center in the emergency room, and so they had to have this child emergencied from down towards San Diego, Temecula area, up to Loma Linda because of these vaccines. And if her sister wasn't working at the emergency room at Loma Linda, they would have lost the boy from these vaccines. And of course, you know, they said that they couldn't determine if it was a vaccine issue because the doctor had administered 4 of them at once.
Right. Because if he had only administered 1, then they couldn't determine that it was a vaccine issue because other children get vaccines and don't have the same episode. I mean, rational thought is not in high evidence in these cases.
You know, and it's just like when you go through the whole case of, the whole case against Andrew Wakefield and the academic fraud that was committed by Richard Horton at the Lancet, and I think he's got a big lawsuit against him regarding that, and you know, covering up the whole Wakefield case for the government over there. You know, so that is still another level of the story that's yet to be told, and I'm not sure. I think Wakefield may have had a lawsuit against Horton and the Lancet for academic fraud.
Yes, and you know, it's interesting. Wakefield never said vaccines cause autism. Wakefield still believes in vaccines.
He talked about that on my show too.
On my program. He thinks it's a cool idea, and I thought, well, you know, wisdom and intelligence are not necessarily the same thing. Yeah, he believes in vaccines.
He discovered the real piece of the story, but he was, you know, he was still too caught up in the paradigm to see the bigger picture. But, you know, I think he's, you know, slowly gained more awareness of that, unless maybe you've talked to him more than I have. I haven't spoken to him for a couple of years, but anyway.
I've spoken to him fairly recently, and we were at an event together in California, and he said if only they would give vaccines one at a time. And I said, no, vaccines are completely useless. I will be happy to send you information showing you that it's a fraudulent premise that we need to vaccinate. It doesn't work, and it causes damage. And he said, well, I don't think that could be true. So, you know, everybody's in a state of evolution, hopefully, but he still believes in vaccines. There you go. The point is that he was attacked viciously because he threatened the hegemony of
and all
the
he
globalist
did was raise
agenda.
The question, is it possible? You know, and that's the sad thing. And his research was accepted for, a decade before they came out and attacked him for it.
Actually, he did not raise the question. He said, is it possible that some of the gastrointestinal problems that children have are subsequent to
And then
vaccination?
related
And these
possibly to
children happen to be
autism. Yeah.
autistic. And other people said, oh my God, this chink in the armor has just been opened. We have to make sure that no one else sees it. And of course, in the blundering, dunderheaded way of the globalists, they made sure that nobody saw it by shining huge amounts of energy onto it so that everybody could see it. But autism is an intentional disorder. I don't believe that autists, that the globalists have perfected their vaccine strategy yet. They're working on it. And so they make a lot of blunders, and there are a lot of people who will never rise to the worker level because they're too impaired, but they're perfecting it. They're working on it. This is a work in progress for these monsters. Your kid doesn't matter. My kid doesn't matter. The fact that if you as an adult take 5 consecutive flu shots, your chances of having Alzheimer's increase by 600%.
Let
That
me ask
doesn't
you
matter
this,
either.
because, obviously another big issue with Alzheimer's and going back to fats again is, and I talked about this, I think, with William Davis and maybe a couple of the other doctors I've had on my show, is there a correlation between the Lipitor and all the statin drugs being sold and the low-fat diet directly relating to Alzheimer's and Parkinson's?
Yes, yes.
She's like, I've been saying this forever.
I'm nodding my head so vigorously. I'm nodding my head so vigorously that my headphones are
You're
sliding
like,
off
yes,
my
somebody
ears.
else knows.
Absolutely, without a question. Let's talk about fat in the brain. The brain is 50% fat. Most
Isn't
of
it
that
closer
fat,
to 70?
pardon me? Well, the normal brain, as far as I know, I'm not talking about the insulation around the nerves.
Okay.
I'm not
All right.
talking about the white matter. When you include the white matter, which is the myelin sheath, then
Okay.
you're up to 70. But the brain
All right.
matter itself is about 50% fat. Okay? That fat has to come from somewhere.
Does it come
Cholesterol
from
is
corn
the
oil?
principal molecule. If you're not lucky, yeah. And when you're not talking about the, you also have to talk about the membranes of each cell. And the membranes are a bimolecular layer that's composed of a protein and a fat stuck together. And that layer has to be able to move. Openings have to be able to be created and then closed. Channels have to be functional. And all of that depends on good fats. Lots and lots and lots and lots of good fats. Now, if you take good fats away,
There's my bulletproof coffee, folks.
there you go. There you go. Well, here is my mug of Valley of the Moon coffee, which is organic coffee that we grow that supports the Natural Solutions Foundation in its health freedom efforts. www.valleyofthemooncoffee.org. No chemicals. I did. You brought up the coffee. I didn't. So the point that I'm making is that fat is essential. Now, if you reduce cholesterol, what you do is reduce sex hormones, and now, of course, you can sell erectile dysfunction drugs. You reduce the ability of the brain and the entire nervous system to function properly. You reduce the ability of all those membranes to operate fluidly and flexibly. And now you're selling drugs for every damn thing under the sun because you need these functions in order to be functional, if you will. So now let's talk about cholesterol levels. Normal cholesterol for an adult, male or female, is somewhere around 220, 230 total cholesterol. Normal today has been redefined as 100, less than one half. People who have a total cholesterol of less than 150 have a much higher incidence of suicide because they're depressed, because their brains aren't working. They have a much higher incidence, and so they go on psychiatric drugs and they become brain damaged, which is what psychiatric drugs do, and they become dependent and they become dead a lot. People who have low cholesterol, 150 or less, have many, many, many more heart attacks and strokes. They have more cancer because the immune system needs fats, good fats. Cholesterol lowering drugs increase by 300% the incidence of cancer, of stroke, and of coronary disease, heart attacks, and of course, mortality from all causes. Sounds like a hell of a marketing deal to me. How about to you? Why don't we kill the fat metabolism? Why don't we sell a whole lot of drugs? And why don't we knock off
Right.
just a whole hell of a lot of people while we're
and then we
making them
tell them
infertile?
to eat their healthy whole grains and wheat in the process, which also causes all of the inflammation, all of the obesity. It attacks the brain. It's like one of the first things that people experience when they get off wheat after 7 to 10 days is a cloud lifts off of their brain. And it acts on the opium receptor sites. It is an addictive food, etc. So there are all of these different things. So, when you get the wheat and the low-fat diet and then also the low salt on top of that, back in Roman times, you were worth your weight in salt, right? There was a reason why
Exactly.
Gandhi was able to use salt as a weapon against the British Empire. It wasn't because...
And the word salary means
Right.
your salt. That's what you were paid in if you were a legionnaire of the British Empire,
Sure.
of the
Yeah, that's
Roman
a very
Empire.
good point. Thank you. Salary, salinity, salt, duh. Now it makes perfect sense. Thank you for that obvious connection there. So, we can...
I specialize
yeah,
in
me
the
too,
obvious.
usually, but I missed that one. So, that's really interesting, though, is that, and we had after I had David Asprey on my show the first time about bulletproof coffee, within a few days after we did the show, this guy, I think his name was Michael, contacts me, many years sufferer of MS. And after a couple of weeks of listening to the show, he took himself off the diet, or off the wheat, put himself on a high-fat diet, like I put 3 ounces of grass-fed butter in my coffee every morning, and then taking a half to a teaspoon of salt in the morning with a glass of water. So in a couple of weeks, he entirely reversed his MS, was walking around on crutches or using a cane for years, had a 3-year-old, couldn't run and play with him, and within a few weeks, he had completely reversed it.
We talked about only a limited number of ways for things to go wrong. MS is a final common pathway. And in his case, it wasn't an autoimmune attack on his body, on his myelin sheath system, as it is in some people's case. It was a nutritional deficiency. And his requirement for nutrients and for oils, which are a macronutrient, and for salt, was not being met. And his body showed symptoms which the doctors called MS, when in fact he was showing nutritional deficiencies. Had we been able to take a voice print of this patient, we would have been able to say to him, here's what you're lacking, and you need these things in your diet, and you need these other frequencies. That's one of the ways that I treat people. That's another show.
I was going to say, how do you do a voice print? You see me reaching for the mic volume here.
Okay, you would do a 30-second speech print, and you would send it to me as a WAV file, and I would analyze it and bang it up against my database, and I would come back to you and say, here's the problem, here's what's not present, here's what's overrepresented, here's the poison, here's the whatever, and then we could create both an acoustic and a nutritional and possibly other type of program from that. So that's one of the things. Remember, I don't use drugs, so I had to get smart, because those are the easy answers, and they don't work.
I'm sure people are screaming right now, quackery. So, as you...
Yes, probably. Let me remind your listeners what the word quack means. The people who used Quarksilber, which is German for mercury, and doctors used mercury to treat syphilis and to treat a number of other diseases, and it cured them when the patient died, by the way, because the patient was dead and no longer had syphilis or whatever they had been suffering from at the point of their death or after they died. The doctors who used Quarksilber were known as quarks, which became quack in English. I would say conventional dentists would fit there. And so it generalized to doctors who did things that were not supposed to be done or were not part of the general mainstream. To me, not practicing alternative medicine, practicing instead advanced medicine, and knowing that allopathic doctors who practice the poor alternative are the real quacks, I take great amusement from that. If it's unfamiliar, it doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means you need to learn something else. That's how I look at it.
Very well said. All right, Dr. Rima Laibow. How do I pronounce that again? Laibow, excuse me. I had it right earlier, excuse me. So why don't you tell the audience what is the single most important concept that you would like them to take away from your first interview here at Gnostic Media?
Can I split that into two? Thank you. The first single most important concept is you need to be at the webinar on September 11th. You need to go to http://tinyurl.com/autism inside job. That's tinyurl.com/autism inside job. And you need to register, read what's there, and then register for that webinar, which will also bring you a free ebook with a huge amount of information. Every one of us is touched by autism, either as a family member or a member of society or as a taxpayer. We're all touched by autism, and it is an intentional destruction of ourselves and our children. It must stop. That's tinyurl.com/autism inside job September 11th at 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Be there, bring other people to be there. It's literally life-saving. And the other thing is you own your body. No corporation owns your body. No doctor owns your body. No one else owns your body. If someone else controls what may and may not, must and must not, should and should not go into your body, then you are a slave, because that is the essence of the slave state. Somebody else controls what happens to your body. If you own it, then you have to take responsibility and seize the freedom to have the information, to have the options, and to have the materials that you need for the use and care of a healthy body for yourself, and if you're a parent, for your children. That is the fundamental state of freedom or slavery. Take your pick. If somebody else is making your decisions, then you are not free. And if you're not free, there is really only one other state. You are owned by the corporate state. Your choice.
Well said, Rima. Well, thank you so much, and I will be there along with Clint on the 11th, and you, and I don't know who else. Do you want to tell us who else is going to be presenting on that day?
Absolutely. Dr. Brian Hooker, who through fierce determination and freedom of information pounding at the government has unearthed the fraudulent nature, the incredibly toxic deceit around vaccinations. Dr. Boyd Haley, one of the world's leading neuroscientists, will be talking about the neurological impact of vaccines and the incredible deceit around the vaccine system. Christina England, after whom I named the hypothesis, the England hypothesis, who is a journalist of incredible depth and skill, will be presenting. Clint will be presenting on the educational system designed to dumb and delta us. And then, of course, you'll be there, and our audience will have an opportunity to interact. Ralph Fusatola, an internationally respected freedom lawyer and one of the trustees of my foundation, the Natural Solutions Foundation, will be there, and General Stubblebine, the president of the foundation. And of course, I'll be there. That's September 11th, 8 to 10 p.m. tinyurl.com/autism inside job. And I want to say thank you, Jan. It's been such a pleasure to have this interchange with you and to share thoughts and information.
Yeah, well, you know, it's exciting when you meet somebody who's on the same page going, yeah, you know, we get it, you know. How did we both come to all of these same conclusions on completely different paths? Me coming up through ethnomycology, of all things, the study of psychedelic mushrooms, and coming to the same conclusion as you as an MD and psychiatrist. So there you go.
There is a possibility that we're both crazy.
Well, you know, unfortunately, in our favor, we have a lot of citations and documentation to back up what we think, whereas the other side just has a lot of name calling and stuff. So,
well, they lie.
Yeah,
they lie. And they have, you know, when they run out of money, they have their friends print them some more. So they have a lot of influence, but they lie. It's been a delight, and I really look forward to more opportunities. May I tell people about our radio show? Thank you. Thursday night from 10 to midnight at freedomslips.com, freedomslips.com, Studio B. You will find the Dr. Rima Truth Reports. And I hope, Jan, that you will be one of our guests in the near future.
Well, thank you so much. I look forward to that, and just let me know when, and we'll have to make it happen.
Perfect.
So we'll have to get some of that stuff that we managed in that 2.5-3-hour conversation the other day. I mean, we should have recorded that and turned that into a few shows. Anyway. All right, Rima, and thank you so much.
Thank you.